I'm Aaron David Miller, and this is Carnegie Connects. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I truly hope you're sound, safe, and of course, very healthy. I'm Aaron David Miller, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and welcome to Carnegie Connects, a set of virtual, hopefully at some point in-person presentations and conversations on issues of critical importance to America and to the world. Today, I'm very pleased to host Zalmay Khalilzad, a former colleague and friend, for a discussion of U.S. policy in Afghanistan. I must say that no American stood at the forefront, or at least in the center, of U.S. Afghan policy for as long as Ambassador Khalilzad has. He is, in a kind of sense, I don't mean to trivialize this, the Forrest Gump of U.S. Afghan policy. He was there in the wake of 2001, the Loya Jirga, Bonn, first elections, then went on to become ambassador to Afghanistan and then Iraq. So I'm pleased to welcome you, Zal, this morning to Carnegie Connects. It's been a long time since the halcyon days of our collaboration and policy planning and working for then Secretary of State George Shultz and our travels, which I do remember fondly, if not hazardly, through the region. Much has changed since that time. I do want to talk to you about and get some thematic altitude to talk about the broader view of Afghanistan and review what went right and what went wrong. But I want to drill down initially on some specific issues. Let's start first with the fact that last week you resigned as Special U.S. Envoy for Afghan reconciliation. Was it why? Was it by mutual agreement? Was it time? What was your thinking in order to step down after such a long involvement in this issue?
Well, first of all, thank you, Aaron, and it's great to be with you. As you said correctly, we worked together in the 1980s, so it's we have known each other for a long time. Thanks for this opportunity. With regard to the question, in fact, there were two real reasons for leaving when I did. One was that we were in a new phase in terms of Afghanistan policy with the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan, with the government collapsing. The situation with regard to reconciliation was no longer a central topic focus of U.S. foreign policy. And second was my concern that in this new phase, our policy was being constrained, what we needed to do in terms of advancing the national interest in Afghanistan, by politics, by the unrealistic, and sometimes, I must say, ill-informed discussion and debate that imposed constraint on pursuing a policy that served the national interest. And therefore, I thought that I perhaps would be more useful, I could make a contribution if by participating in the public arena in the debate outside the government, so that hopefully we will see whether I succeed in that, given the administration the opportunity to decide not so much based on political constraints, but based on to make it easier politically to pursue what would serve the U.S. interest going forward in Afghanistan.
I mean, with honesty and clarity, there is a real advantage to being out there in the public conversation. But what is it? What was it about the debate? And I assume you're referring to the debate not inside an administration, but the public conversation surrounding the withdrawal. What were the elements that you felt were not being, what are we missing, in essence?
Right. Well, I think there is a lot of anger out there, both inside parts of our government and, of course, huge disappointment. And the perception is that the Taliban are a terrorist organization, very unpopular based on the commentary that has been made, that perhaps will produce a policy that will be counterproductive to our interest if we say or take steps that contributes to the failure of the Afghan state by not engaging seriously with the Talibs, not allowing funds to go to the country, freezing the accounts of the government of Afghanistan. That would bring about the collapse, and in turn, one reason for the agreement for withdrawal was to bring Afghanistan to an appropriate level of U.S. engagement and expenditure of resources, both financial, military, and diplomatic attention. And we're heading in that direction. But if Afghanistan collapses, the state collapses, there is a civil war, there is huge humanitarian crisis that millions of Afghans would have to leave the country. It will destabilize the region. It will create problems in terms of our relation with allies, because they would be mostly heading towards Europe. And it would create space for terrorism, for terrorists, again, ungoverned spaces, where then Afghanistan, contrary to what we would like, become again a huge problem and a huge item that would absorb our attention. So I think what we need to do is to look at our interests and then pursue policies based on that. And I'm sure we will talk about what I would advocate. But that was, I thought that was not being allowed to do what's in our interest, was not being, but because of politics, was not being pursued because the president and others felt constrained.
That's a fascinating insight. In fact, that's the first time I think in all of your interviews I've heard you express the view that what is required now, and correct me if I'm wrong, is a more broad-minded approach that looks at the well-being of the Afghan state, Taliban or no Taliban, tethered to what we believe are our national interests. But it bumps up against the realities of American domestic politics, and what clearly is a well-deserved demonization based on how the Taliban is behaving. So I was going to get to this later, but you raised it, so let's get to it now. How do you reconcile the fact that as winter approaches in a country of some 23 million people, you've got food insecurity that may represent famine, if not starvation, to large numbers of Afghans, particularly children? How should we, given the mistrust of the Taliban and their behavior so far in certain areas, how do you reconcile the two?
Well, I mean, rather than driven by kind of what happened in terms of the fact that we did not succeed in defeating them, and that has left a bad taste in people's mouth, and of course the behavior of the Taliban in the 90s when they were in government, and although it's not exactly the same, but it's not what it should be. We could let the Talibs fail and contribute to that failure, or we could, which I advocate, is to look at our interests going forward. And those interests are clearly counterterrorism is important. That remains vital. But also in terms of human rights, in terms of the welfare of the Afghan people, and the Talibs seek normal relations with us. They would like us to reopen the embassy. They would like to have access to the monies that belong to Afghanistan in the US and in Europe. And they would like to have economic assistance. So I believe that we need to sit with them to agree to a roadmap that takes into account the issue of our distrust or mistrust of each other, and therefore behavior that we expect has to take place over a time period, so that we can see a pattern, and in exchange for that, the specific steps that we would take. And I believe that while we are engaging them on terrorism, on moving towards a roadmap, I think there are constraints because of the unpopularity of the Taliban. Some deserved, some by the kind of the anger and disappointment and disagreement with regard to our withdrawal that is in the body politic is having I would say effects that are contrary to our interests, because I believe that if the state of Afghanistan collapses, our interests, including the human rights interests, including the terrorism interests, will suffer, and we would become once again potentially refocused significantly to deal with the consequences of that.
We did not pursue a conditions-based withdrawal in the end. You referred to it as a calendar-based withdrawal, and it certainly was, even though I want to get back to the issue of the February 2020 agreement. But what you seem to be suggesting now is a sort of condition-based peace.
Right.
Or
normalcy.
Process. Right. Normalcy with the Taliban. They do things and we do things.
Right. And they linked to each other specifically in writing and in detail.
Right. I mean, I hate to introduce this fact, but what you're suggesting is that the Biden administration do serious diplomacy with directly with the Taliban.
And with the neighboring states and with the other powers that have influence. The more we have others with us, I think that will make it also easier politically if we did pursue what I'm advocating in collaboration with allies, because they have a lot of interest, particularly our European allies. On their number one concern is refugees. The collapse will produce refugees there, and with on terrorism, we have a broad international consensus. So I would think that that's what needs to happen. But I think what you said, the real diplomatic engagement with the objective that I described. But I believe that it's politically and palatable. There are people who would say we shouldn't lift a finger to do anything. Let the Taliban who did what they did, including what happened in terms of our withdrawal, let them suffer. So they wanted to take over the country. They did, and let's see what happens.
So a lot of this rests on the bona fides of the Taliban and whether the Talibs have indeed evolved, not because their ideology has changed, because the exigencies of their circumstances are now different. Conquering a country is one thing, governing it and having responsibility for the well-being of 23 million people is quite another. Is this, and why should we believe, based on the Talibs' behavior so far, that this isn't simply any amelioration of their hardline views toward women, toward other minorities in Afghanistan? toward providing sanctuary for ISIS-K. In your view, is there any reason to believe this is not Taliban 1.0 and somehow it's now 2.0?
Well, I do believe that the Taliban have changed in some ways, and are the same in other ways, and that there are differences of view inside. There are factions inside, and on issues that you described, for example, on ISIS-K. They are the worst enemy of ISIS-K, and we have a common interest with them. And in fact, they have committed themselves to the destruction of ISIS-K. We could ideally, although the Talibs would not want to appear because it could cause them difficulties politically, with more Islamist elements than that they are a partner of the United States in fighting some other Muslims. But nevertheless, they have fought ISIS-K. They have done in the past a good job of it. We will see. Right now, they seem to be having challenges in dealing with ISIS-K. They could benefit from some understanding and help from outside in dealing with that. Second, I think people think that they don't keep their word. They're not trustworthy. But I have to say that in the agreement that we made with them, they agreed not to attack the United States forces after the signing of the agreement, despite the fact that we must have killed hundreds, if not thousands, of Talibs after that agreement, because we had the right to come to the assistance of the Afghan forces. Not a single American was killed by them during the 18 months of the withdrawal period. I know there were a lot of pressures on them since we were bombing them when they were attacking Afghan forces that they should respond. And on terrorism issues, they agreed not to allow terrorist groups, including Al-Qaeda, which was important to get it to be mentioned specifically, that they did stick to the agreement not to allow plotting and planning by terrorist groups against the United States and allies. Now we need more from them since we're not there. And on human rights, they're not the same. They're not where we would like them, whether universal standards, not American standards, universal standards are, but they're not the same as the 90s. There is a change, and the change is that now, in private universities, men and women are going, and in the old Taliban, only 900 boys went to school. No girls' school were allowed. And in high school, they're saying they're moving, but not with the speed to open all high schools for girls and boys. So far, they have opened it for boys. Girls, only 3-4 provinces. They say they are because they believe in separate education for girls and boys, that they have not organized themselves in terms of to do that. So yes, there are issues with regard to human rights, but I think we have to think about what the collapse would mean and the humanitarian suffering and of the Afghan people. So therefore, I favor what I described.
Yeah, you've been around the block on this issue far longer than I have, for sure. But is it credible to give the Talibs the benefit of the doubt, given their policies on women and girls, given the advances that have been made over the course of the last 2 decades, the openness, access to internet, change in social mores, which according to some, even according to you, has literally transformed the country. Talibs may be in control, but it's not the same Afghanistan. And I guess the real question is, to what degree are they prepared to accept these new trend lines, which are quite impressive? I remain pretty skeptical on this. But again, over to you, particularly on the issue of women and rights of women and girls. Where are we on this?
So skepticism is justified. There is no question about that. But skepticism shouldn't lead to paralysis. Skepticism should lead to exploration, to how we shape whatever we do. What we do, if there is an agreement on a roadmap, depends on what they do. I believe that the engagement, given their strong needs, they have an interest in surviving. Certainly, they have an interest in, and there may be some who say, well, we will do everything if something based on Islam, their interpretation, and if it doesn't work, it must be God's will. No compromise with the unbeliever. I mean, I'm sure there are elements in the Taliban and these forces and other parts of the region as well. But I think there are pragmatists also inside the Taliban that might, in exchange for normalcy, moving step by step toward normalcy, in exchange for assistance, in exchange for engagement on support, that they would be incentivized to make it easier for those who are advocates of a positive evolution on issues of concern. They might never achieve what we would like to see them be, but at least to not to take Afghanistan back, which will be very difficult. And you're right, to the situation of the 1990s. I think a policy of engagement, of roadmap that they do in exchange for what we do, and taking into account the issue of mistrust. I'm from the school of trust but verify, and I think that would apply here.
It's a long and well-established school. So picking up on that point, let's get to the issue of America's core vital interest in Afghanistan. I don't want to dismiss values at all, and human rights, but we entered Afghanistan as a consequence of a national security issue. Are you confident, and you were responsible for negotiating the February 2020 agreement on the issue of the Taliban's commitments and undertakings on counterterrorism? Are you satisfied, based on what you've seen or what you intuit, that we are that those commitments can be relied upon?
Well, I think we have to hold them to those commitments. We have noticed and observed that in terms of allowing plotting and planning, they've taken steps not to allow that. Now, if we want them to expel folks, because at one point we didn't want some people expelled because we thought if they leave Afghanistan, where we were there with forces that could take steps, they could go around to places where it would be harder for us to get to them, to bring them to justice, as President Bush liked to say. But I believe that they've suffered a great deal of 19 years of war. A lot of their people killed, lost power. I think they have told me repeatedly they don't want to repeat that mistake again for Afghanistan, for Taliban, which has been given a second chance, to put it all at risk again. So I think it's in their interest not to do that. Perhaps in extreme circumstance, if they were falling apart and there were no other resources, but terrorists were willing to help them financially, if they might, I don't know. But I believe whatever agreement we make, at the same time, we must have the ability, although maybe less than when we were in Afghanistan, to observe, to monitor. That's why the President Biden is talking about over the horizon monitoring. and at the same time, we have to have the ability to strike if necessary. So I believe agreement with them and having relations with them and monitoring and being able to strike if needed. That's the package that will be at much lower cost for us in terms of the resources required than if we were continuing to prosecute a war in Afghanistan, a war that wasn't going well. We were losing territory each year, costing 40 billion and thousands of troops. While the terrorist threat in Afghanistan had changed significantly, it wasn't what it was like prior to 9/11. There were just a few hundred with dozens only of serious Al-Qaeda types, perhaps in the country. That sort of problem existed in many other countries in the region and beyond. And why would we kind of put the kind of resources that we were putting in Afghanistan? And that was the question that the presidents, both Trump and Biden, were asking us.
The commitments on counterterrorism are pretty specific. No hosting, no fundraising, no recruiting.
Right.
Am I right to assume that there are other commitments that have not been made public with respect to the counterterrorism front? And if they haven't been made public, have they been briefed to Congress?
Yes, everything that we have agreed, including the classified parts, 2 parts that were classified, have been briefed to everyone who had the clearances, and Congress included. Yes.
So they have been, and there are additional specific commitments. The other curious thing in your interview with Face the Nation with Margaret Brennan, the two of you got into a very interesting conversation, brief though it was, on the question of whether or not it was feasible for the Biden administration to actually negotiate some sort of residual American presence.
Yes. Well,
in Afghanistan.
Sure.
And I wondered, because I thought you had inferred that had the withdrawal been handled differently, right, there might have been an opportunity to actually negotiate either for intelligence purposes or for counterterrorism purposes, a residual U.S. presence. Sounds quite fantastical to me, but you're on the inside.
Well,
I
think that there was a U.S. national interest that many believed in, that it would be good to have a residual presence in Afghanistan. Although whether the President Biden or President Trump would have ultimately wanted that was to be determined. But it became clear from the initial engagements with the Taliban that as Taliban, they would not agree, as part of our agreement with the Talibs, for the presence of a residual force after the main forces were out. And the reason that the Talibs said repeatedly that although they look forward to cooperation with the United States after the agreement, but that accepting a residual force would undermine the very rationale for which they have sacrificed so much, fought the United States and the coalition for so many years, because they sold it to their people as resisting occupation, a foreign military presence on their territory. And therefore, as Talibs, they couldn't agree on paper that there could be a residual force. But they said, however, since the agreement with the U.S. opens the door to inter-Afghan negotiations and an agreement on the future political order, when that new order, that new government, was sometimes we call them interim, transitional, power-sharing government, that government then will decide the longer term. And only in that scenario could they envisage the possibility of some residual U.S. forces staying as part of a national decision.
So not as a political movement, but as a government, whatever power sharing, I think is a nice euphemism for what ultimately has already taken place and what probably will. But as a government dominated, controlled by Taliban,
I think unlikely, very unlikely. I would say no chance, because now the Talibs will have to decide to allow for a military presence. I think what they were saying at that time is that let's say it's a 50-50, whatever the percentage was, government between the Republic and the Talibs. Because the Republic elements or other elements might want an American military presence, because they would argue we need the American support to build and sustain our national security institutions. We need American economic assistance, and in order to get that assistance, it is more likely that we would get it if there was a presence, because Congress would vote for significant resources than if there wasn't. So it was in a different environment and a different scenario than the scenario that we have now.
Right. So it was a momentary opportunity, if in fact it was an opportunity at all.
It would have meant that the Afghan forces would not have collapsed. It would have meant that President Ghani was serious about negotiations. He wouldn't run away, and that they would sit together. And as the Talibs were willing, although I don't want to absolve the Talibs of responsibility also for the lack of progress on political power sharing or a political settlement. Yeah. But I think the poor performance of the Afghan security forces, despite the billions and billions and almost 20 years of U.S. investment, this is one of the issues that we would have to examine, learn lessons from it. Why did it that despite this huge effort, the Afghan military did not perform in terms of resisting the Talibs once the U.S. forces were out, or once it became clear that the U.S. forces are leaving?
I don't want to relitigate the past, but I do need to ask you about the February 2020 agreement. I think General McMaster described it as a surrender agreement. Others have characterized it not as a peace agreement, but as essentially a withdrawal agreement. Looking back now, some have accused you of essentially masterminding U.S.-Afghan policy. All conditions are not created equal. That agreement had 4 basic components: a withdrawal timetable, commitments on counterterrorism, commitment to inter-Afghan reconciliation, power sharing, and a comprehensive ceasefire. In the end, Zal, let me ask, battlefield realities seem to dictate that only the first 2 of those commitments were likely to be adhered to. You must have understood this at the time. You were given an assignment to negotiate. You negotiated a package. 2 elements of the package never materialized. And that's where the criticism lies, correct? Excluding the Ghani government, legitimizing the Talibs, delegitimizing Ghani. Was all of this clear to you as crystal during the period leading up to the agreement and afterwards?
First, a couple of factual issues. We did not neglect the government. The government and the Talibs were refusing to negotiate with the government because they regarded the government as a puppet installed by the foreign occupation forces, as they saw it. And for 15, 16 years, our preference was for the government and the Talibs to sit across the table to negotiate. But the Talibs said they wanted to negotiate with us first, and that opened the door to face-to-face negotiations. So that goal was achieved. An element of the third element that you mentioned, inter-Afghan negotiation, for the government and the Talibs to sit across the table. Historic. First time in 40 years of war. Now, I think there are two comments to make broadly on what you said. One is that the agreement was consisted of those 4 packages. It was up to our president to decide whether he wanted to hold the Talibs, to say, we could have said to them, since there isn't an agreement on a power sharing or on a comprehensive ceasefire, we would not want to withdraw, therefore, until, because our delivery on our commitment depended on them delivering on their commitments. But I think over time, as you say correctly, 2 things happened. One, we were all surprised by the intransigence, frankly, of the President Ghani in insisting to stay in power until his term, despite the fact that he had come out re-elected in a fraudulent election that very few Afghans participated. Some 18% of the population of 40 million Afghans participated in that election. And then 2 presidents declared themselves after that election, which we discouraged them from holding it rather than establishing a peace government for negotiations. But in any case, that was one, and therefore people became pessimistic on a political settlement and fearful that if we stick to that condition, we'll get stuck in Afghanistan indefinitely as they will not negotiate. And second, the withdrawal, the performance of Afghan forces, I think, was another surprise. I think very few people would have anticipated that this force of 300,000 facing a force of 60 to 70,000 with all the equipment and having American military support disintegrated and did not fight. And that may have had to do much more with politics of Afghanistan, that people didn't believe in it, the soldiers and the cause. The Taliban believed in their cause. Corruption had undermined the legitimacy, maybe in the eyes of the people or the soldiers who would have didn't want to risk their lives for that. There may have been how the government had treated the soldiers in terms of paying their salaries on time and what have you. So there are a lot of factors that would explain and we have to learn more about that and learn lessons from it. But I think the agreement provided the option for the president to decide whether to pursue a condition-based approach. And in fact, I said to Congress in August of 2020 that once we get to the end of the first phase of our withdrawal to go to 8,600, we would do a study of whether the Taliban have made conditions, have met the condition before we move to the next phase. But ultimately, President Biden decided to pursue a calendar-based approach. That wasn't the problem of the agreement. It was the problem of the performance. Mostly, I would think of our side in Afghanistan that led the president decide that if we make it condition-based, we will get stuck, and therefore to go for a calendar-based approach.
Right. In the spirit of the worst spirit of bipartisanship, I would also say that it also seemed fairly clear, or should have been clear, that under the Trump administration, the prime directive was withdrawal.
Sure, absolutely. No, I didn't mean to. I didn't mean to signal anything different.
You want to make sure that calendar-based withdrawal, I think, characterized both the Trump administration and the Biden administration.
Yeah.
You know, I know from my own personal experience that negotiators can easily, without much effort, get so involved and wrapped up in their negotiations that they lose some sense of perspective. They get too close to the people with whom they're negotiating.
Right.
That charge has been leveled, or that critique has been leveled against you, that you were too close to Ghani. You knew him personally. There was a certain amount of animosity, particularly probably because he knew you were negotiating with the Talibs. Does any of that resonate with you looking back now?
No,
were you too close to the negotiations?
Well,
part of the mystery, just one last point, part of the mystery of Zalmay Khalilzad is that you were born in Afghanistan.
right.
You have a special feel and expertise.
Right.
It would be completely unnatural if you didn't.
Right.
And that gave you an extraordinary advantage in many respects. I guess my question is, was it also disadvantageous, do you think?
Well, others would have to judge that, Aaron. Of course, I have a lot of experience in negotiating. After all, helped Afghans negotiate their constitution, their first election. I helped Iraqis negotiate their constitution and their kind of reconciliation effort, mixed results, and the UN. So, and I studied the issue. I had certain advantages also because of my knowledge of the culture and the languages and the body language even, and the kind of implied messages. But I leave it to others to judge. I think President Ghani and I have had known each other for a long time. In fact, he said to me that Pompeo had called him when he was thinking of appointing someone for a reconciliation effort or for peace, and he had recommended me as the best person to do so. He said it on many occasions. But I think it was more my mission was, which was to get an agreement that ensured U.S. withdrawal, but also dealt with terrorism and Afghans negotiating with each other. And he just simply was not prepared, given the realities on the ground, especially if you took the U.S. forces out of the equation to adjust. For a long time, his grand miscalculation was that he didn't think were serious about withdrawal, that we would never withdraw. How could you withdraw from a country which was close to China, Pakistan, Iran, Russia? This was the most valuable piece of real estate in the world. And I tried to persuade him that no, President Trump was very serious. And he said, no, the intelligence or military tells me otherwise. I told him, listen, just believe me, this is very serious. We want to get out. And then I think he miscalculated badly about the performance of his forces, because he was happy, he said at the end, when President Biden decided to withdraw. He said, now I'm free to fight the war the Afghan way. And in 6 months, you will see I would defeat the Taliban forces because you were fighting it poorly, incorrectly. I think that was a fundamental challenge. No matter who the negotiator was, I think this President Ghani's insistence to serve his term until it was too late and not to step aside. He wanted the Talibs to become part of his government, and the Talibs wanted a new government to be negotiated with someone that would to be acceptable to both sides to lead that government, and that would have been not President Ghani.
One final question, Zal, and you've been very generous with your time, and that is deals with the issue of accountability or responsibility, which people who have served the Republic often have a very difficult time assuming. As you look back now on a long involvement, decades in this problem, do you bear any personal responsibility with respect to your own regrets about things or anything that you did that was consequential enough that it would have made a difference in the way things actually turned out?
I will reflect on that in the first instance. Of course, I'm responsible for what I did, and I take responsibility for that. I mean, I was the chief negotiator, I was the ambassador earlier, and I had a personal attention to Afghanistan because of the fact that I was born there. Even when I was not in government, I paid attention. With happiness served on the board of the American University of Afghanistan, which I helped establish when I was ambassador. I at the Education Foundation built a high school for girls in Kabul, and I am disappointed in that the elite that we worked with that they didn't rise to the occasion, this golden opportunity that the American engagement provided, that the state and nation building, institution building that we supported massively, but that did not succeed in the way we succeeded in terms of the dismantling or decimation of terrorism. But in terms of, we succeeded in transforming Afghan society in terms of education, the young people, their skills, the development of our cities, infrastructure, but that we didn't transform the politics to have an enlightened, national interest-focused elite serving their people. They became very selfish, self-centered, corrupt, and failed in that mission. And since we all had a role in helping them, including myself personally, maybe there is something that but I can tell you with full confidence that I tried, although it didn't work, I tried my very best for reasons of America's interest and America that I represented, so that we have a good legacy left behind. But also, I have never forgotten who I am, where I was born, where my family is buried, where my roots are. To do the best that I could, try as hard as I could, use all my skills and abilities, limited as they are, to give peace a chance for Afghans to come to end their long war, because the people of Afghanistan were yearning for peace. Every day, 200-300 Afghans were killing. Some people forget that the reasons we wanted to do this is not only ourselves, but also the people of Afghanistan were tired of this 40-year-long war. And that mission is not complete. That mission still remains valid, and we should do what we can as given our engagement and the sacrifices and the lives that have been lost, to do what we can to help them to get to that destiny, that place that they should, a peaceful country at peace with itself and with the world, and developing over time.
Zalmay Khalilzad, thank you so much for joining us on Carnegie Connects. I know you will continue to reflect on those years. Take care, and thanks to all of you for joining.
Thank you, Aaron. Thank you very much. Nice to be with you.
You too.